Hi, people. So, we've had a lot of news of late. News as in new appointments, new Prime Minister, new monarch. There's going to be a new Doctor Who. There is a new Doctor Who already installed. A new James Bond, and there's also a new head of the Metropolitan Police, which effectively is the highest ranking police officer in the country. Sir Mark Rowley. He's taken over from the troubled tenure of Crusader Dick. Um, I'm going to quote an article here from the newspaper. I've got a newspaper backlog because I'm going through all the papers from the State Funeral and the death of the Queen. Um, so this is from, let's see, the 13th of September. So it's well, almost 2 weeks ago now. But the case is still ongoing, so it's still very relevant. And it's involving a controversial case, the death of Chris Kaba. The killing of Chris Kaba, let's call it what it is, in London. Um, and it's an op-ed from Misha Fraser Carroll, who's a freelance journalist, who's currently writing Mad World, a book about the politics of mental health. Um, I'll get into that in a minute because she raises some interesting points. But I just want to read out an extra report on this case also from the same edition. And this report's by Nick Duffy. The firearms officer who shot dead an unarmed man as he sat in a car has been suspended by the Metropolitan Police amid an independent murder probe into the incident. Father-to-be Chris Kaba, 24, was killed during a police stop in South London on the 5th of September. The police watchdog has launched a murder investigation. Last night, Scotland Yard said the unnamed officer involved had been suspended from duty following careful consideration of a number of factors, including significant impact on public confidence in the light of the Independent Office for Police Conduct announcing a homicide investigation. The decision was taken hours after a new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, began work. The officer had previously been removed from operational duties. Mr. Cabot's family had called for their immediate suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. Mr. Kaba, who was due to get married in 5 months' time, was killed after the car he was driving, which the IOPC said was not registered to him, was flagged by automatic number plate recognition cameras in connection with a firearms incident. No firearms were found at the scene. Um, so here we have a man who's not armed killed by the police, and there's been a suspension. Apparently, the firearms unit of the Metropolitan Police, some of those officers angrily said they were giving up the firearms if in protest at the suspension. And they claimed that their bosses didn't have their backs. Well, here's the thing: the Metropolitan Police has to show the public that they take these things seriously. And as I'm going to read out from the top-ed, there are pressing issues. Um, Frankly, if officers think that they're immune from scrutiny, um, that suggests to me that there's this mindset of we could do what we please because we're wearing a uniform. I mean, it is absolutely appropriate that their superiors take action if professional misconduct is at play. So this idea, oh, they don't have our backs. If you have a soldier who abuses his or her position, they should be held to account, as should anybody, particularly when weapons are involved, or in any profession that involves some degree of authority or some degree of responsibility. I don't support this idea that someone should simply be backed by their boss no matter what, by their superior in this sort of context. Police are public servants, and it is absolutely right that they're held to account, or at least that it's investigated. So that attitude of, well, our bosses don't have our backs. Should they have your backs if you're abusing your position? That would be my question. Um, and I think there's too many people in the police, not just the Metropolitan Police, across the board, who think that simply wearing a uniform means you're immune from critique. That's grotesque. Um, and I'm saying this as someone who's not anti-police at all. But I want to read out this op-ed because, I've been very critical of Black Lives Matter, and I still am. I still think it has clearly racist components. I think they've been far more divisive than productive. But one thing I've always said is they have brought about important debate about police um, police officers abusing their power, or rather, if there's cases where there may be misconduct, or you have someone who dies at police hands, there is important questions to be made about accountability. Now, I don't think this is a contradiction from the positions I've held, which are very hard line on crime. And with that, I want the police to be empowered. I'm not anti police. I want the police to be empowered to do their job. I think, for example, stop and search saves lives. I think the evidence shows that. And I don't want the police hampered by a situation whereby every time they arrest a black suspect, they're surrounded by people yelling racist at them, which has happened in that jurisdiction. But Sir Mark Rowley in his first interview was given on a radio program yesterday. I can't remember which radio station it was, but he said he is going to really work overtime. This isn't verbatim, but he is really going to go out of his way to push out corruption from the force. And officers who are racist or misogynistic, he's going to absolutely get rid of them. That's a good start because, again, there's this thing about the police kind of protecting themselves. When Cressida Dick lost her job, I think rightly so, because she presided over profound corruption in the Metropolitan Force. Clearly, there was a problem in that force. I mean, you had officers who were joking about rape. These are people who may well have to deal with victims of rape. Now, if officers can't have basic sympathy for victims of crime, how can they be entrusted to serve the public? I think that's a no-brainer. There was an interview with Jeffrey DeMarco, who is one of the people at victim support, and he made the very pertinent point that police officers have to have sympathy because often they're the first people that correspond with victims of crime. A victim of crime will be going through shock, mental anguish, a whole range of emotions. Um, Before I get into this op-ed, I just want to say the Rowley has his work cut out for him. There's certainly rebuilding public trust. There's this case, which I'm going to be talking about, the Chris Kaba death. But there's a whole range of other things going on. I do think there are some rotten apples in the Metropolitan Police. They're not fit to wear a uniform. If you have officers, I don't care if they call it banter, if they're joking about rape, if they're making racist jokes, they shouldn't be wearing a uniform in a multicultural city. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. And that's not a left-wing position, that's a common sense position. Um, so I definitely think there should be a zero tolerance approach to those sort of officers. If it means losing their pensions or whatever, it's entirely their own fault. It's not banter. It's a sign of something rotten in Metropolitan Police culture. Um, I think there will be differences between forces. Apparently, Northumbria Police, I was reading in the Sunderland Echo recently, has got an award for outstanding policing. And my last dealing with them was 6 years ago when my bike was stolen. They were polite. They were, when I went to the station, they listened. The woman at the desk did kind of give me a bit of a false pretense. She said, "Oh, in most cases they're fine." Well, that's clearly not true. The officers did turn up quite late. But they were professional. They took my details, and of course, it never got found. But I've read apparently in the Metropolitan Police, in some cases, half of burglaries don't even get a police call out. That's something Riley has to deal with urgently because the police say the public have to report crime. Well, if you have a situation where the police aren't even coming out to reports of crime, and it may be an issue to do with resources, but I think there's other things at play. I think there's a culture in the police where they're spending far too much time on, frankly, woke politics. It's kind of ironic because you have these two extremes. On one hand, and I'm just sticking to the Met here, you have clearly some officers who should not be wearing a uniform. Um, They're bullies, they're misogynists, they're people who should not, they're not in a position to be serving the public quite clearly. Then you have the other extreme. Well, I mentioned I'm sticking to the Met, but actually this goes into all the police forces, which is ridiculous pandering to thought policing. You know, where you have police going out to someone's house because they've used the wrong pronoun online. Police should absolutely not be policing Twitter feuds, as Kimi Badenoch, the Tory leadership candidate, said that they should absolutely not be doing that. In fact, I think she's a cabinet member now. So the police can't blame it all on resources. There is executive decision taken at the top by police superintendents, for example, to use resources. It's a disgrace when police are going out, knocking someone's door and recording non-hate crimes, or actually non-crime hate incidents, whatever that's supposed to mean. I do feel there are legitimate concerns over how this is used. Part of that's the fault of legislators, for putting this stuff into the statute in the first place. But I think the police have no business basically being involved in that. They've much bigger priorities when you have thugs terrorizing society. Now, I'm going to get into this op-ed, but I just wanted to talk about what are his priorities. I mean, talk about a major, I don't want to say baptism of fire, but days into the job, and he has the Queen State funeral to handle. The policing on that must have been profound when you consider all the heads of state and heads of government around the world. The biggest security operation ever, even surpassing G20 summits. So, that really was quite something that he stepped into. But he has a lot of priorities. I think definitely getting rid of corrupt officers is one of them, but also reassuring Londoners by improving the number of call-outs. It's a disgrace. Apparently, in some jurisdictions, is 1 in 21 crimes are dealt with. 1 in 21 in some wards. That's appalling. And I don't know how Londoners have any faith in the police right now. But like I say, there's extremes because on the other hand, you have a significant portion of people are convinced that the police are racist. Anyway, I'm going to read out this op-ed and share some of my thoughts on it because I think she raises some important points. And as much as I've been critical of Black Lives Matter, there are some issues here that can't be just dismissed. Okay, so on Saturday afternoon, hundreds of mourners waved away around Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square. Spotting the gathering during the rolling coverage following the Queen's death, Sky News slowly panned across the crowd as the newsreader described thousands of people still arriving to pay their respects to the Queen. But the droves of people had not come together to mark the death of the 96-year-old monarch. They were protesting against the fatal shooting by police of an unarmed 24-year-old black man named Chris Kaba on Monday last week. Sky may have since issued a correction, but black British people have still taken this as a damning indictment of the British establishment's ambivalent response to yet another police killing of a black person. Well, just on that point, to be fair, there's a lot of news that got overshadowed by the proceedings around the Queen's death. A lot of news. I mean, yeah, there were a lot of other things going on, and it all got overshadowed by the Queen's death. So I'm not sure if it's right to read too much into that. I did see a Sky News report actually with Stormzy addressing people. In 2020, when 46-year-old George Floyd, of course he has to be mentioned, was murdered by a white police officer in the US city of Minneapolis, the UK press turned its attention to Britain's own issues with violent institutional racism. As the focus on racism extended from days to weeks to months, it felt as if our calls might finally have been heard. Well, that's the point. I don't think anyone could claim that the George Floyd thing was underreported. It was one of the biggest stories of 2020. I would argue it got as much coverage as the Queen's death, which, when you consider that he was um, just a guy in Minneapolis, in another country, that's saying something. And by the way, a guy who had a criminal record. I'm not saying he deserved to die, but that's just facts. 2 years down the line, I'm more cynical. The response outside black communities to Mr. Cabo's death, even in the days before the Queen's passing, has been muted and slow. I noticed that I didn't even hear about the shooting, which is now being treated by the Independent Office for Police Conduct as a homicide. until a couple of weeks after, until a couple of days after it took place. It wasn't that the story was not being reported on at all, but that it did not seem to be particularly high priority or to have much cut through, as journalists often put it. Well, it's an important story, but again, what should editors do? There's also a lot of murders and other killings that happen at any particular time. There's a lot of murders that didn't get significant coverage in recent weeks. It wasn't the story, yeah, the killing of any person by police officers should be of public interest, causing outrage and grief. Unfortunately, these deaths are routinely normalized. We are told that those who die at the hands of the police or in prisons are criminals, thugs, must have done something to deserve it, and are therefore deemed unworthy of our attention. However, we know by now that young black men in particular are disproportionately criminalized. They're 19 times more likely to be stopped and searched on Britain's streets, and black people more broadly are more than twice as likely to die during or following contact with the police. Well, this needs to be scrutinised. We need to know why. What are the reasons that is happening? Is it because there is a problem with institutional racism? I think there are racist police officers, as I previously mentioned. The article's not over. I just want to interject at this point. I do think there are racist police officers, and they have no business wearing a uniform. Clearly, I mean, black officers have reported that when they started up in the force, they themselves suffered racism, and this is black police officers. So I think it would be wrong to totally pretend that there isn't racist in the police. Um, but does that mean it is a sweeping problem across the board? I don't know. And will it vary from force to force? Probably. Now, on the issue of black men being 19 times more likely to be stopped and searched, I assume there's been a study into that. 19 times clearly is very disproportionate. Um, and let's see, disproportionately criminalized. Well, I would say this depends on geography, and this is a controversial point, but this is something that black campaigners will not admit, or I think they're not being totally honest about. In London, it is a fact that there's a problem with young black men and gangs. That's a reality. Now, in different jurisdictions, for example, up here in Northeast England, most young offenders are white, okay, because of the demographics of this region. This is a predominantly white region. In somewhere like Tower Hamlets or Newn, the majority of black communities or black and South Asian communities. So if you have a situation where more people who are arrested by the police happen to be a minority, does that really demonstrate institutional racism, or does it demonstrate that actually there is a problem in the black community with young men getting involved in crime? Now, as a white guy, there will be some people who say, "Oh, it's racist to say that." But I'm a firm believer that if you have any problem in society, any problem, it has to be addressed. So take football hooliganism, for example. It's probably dominated by white hooligans. So we need to address it. Um, but I don't think a problem should sort of be dismissed because, so she's saying that this is disproportionate. Well, my question would be maybe it is. Maybe there is a problem with police being more heavy-handed with black suspects. In fact, Theresa May mentioned this in her maiden speech as Prime Minister. Maybe there is a problem there. And I can personally, actually, I had an experience when I was at Wolverhampton University. I was with a Ghanaian friend, and we were going out for the night, and he was trying to find a place to park. And he took a wrong turn. It was an honest mistake. And he tried reversing, and the police basically pulled him over. And it was an honest mistake. He'd just taken a wrong turning and it was like a one-way street or something like that. But the officer was definitely not polite. It was the whole attitude was very confrontational, and I just didn't think it was very professional. And my friend wasn't being rude or standoffish. She was simply saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. So I wouldn't put past some officers to have an attitude, quite frankly. By the same token, there are some people that don't help their own case, and this is very true in the United States, where they won't simply comply with reasonable requests, and they'll automatically assume, oh, it's because I'm black. So it's a bit of both. And I think that, yeah, there are some conservatives who are too quick to dismiss this stuff. But by the same token, there's frankly some black campaigners who simply turn a blind eye to black criminality. I'm sorry, but that's the case. They will not acknowledge that there is a problem with young black men involved in crime. And when you have, in my opinion, a toxic culture around, for example, drill music, which glorifies crime, it absolutely glorifies crime. Those sort of issues need to be addressed. It's like any controversial subject. Take, for example, the transatlantic slave trade. We hear demand for reparations, but what about African complicity in the slave trade? It's not what about to say these things. It's not trying to change the subject. It's simply saying if we're going to talk about a subject, let's talk about everything. Let's talk about all details of that subject and not just cherry pick. So 19 times more likely, that is probably disproportionate. And that, needs to be understood why that's happening. I think I'm not against stop and search. I think it's been proven to save lives because when Boris Johnson was mayor of London, it was used. Among other things, the homicide rate in London went down when Johnson was mayor. Now, say what you want about the man, but that's the reality. Under Sadiq Khan, it's went up. I'm not saying stop and search has been abolished, but it has been, there's certainly been political pressure against it. See, the public carry these racialized stereotypes too. The disproportionate public concern for white victims over black ones has been immortalized in the phrase missing white woman syndrome. There may be some truth in that, so we have to concede that she may have a point there. If you get a young middle class white woman, like Sarah Everard, for example, who's murdered or goes missing, there will be extensive public coverage. Now, it shouldn't be that way if you have a young black woman who goes missing, or a young black man for that matter. There shouldn't be double standards on that. I don't believe in victim hierarchies. Clearly, if you have an 85-year-old pensioner who's beaten to death by burglars, that's going to elicit a strong public response over, say, I don't know, a young man who dies in a fight. But I'm uncomfortable with victim hierarchies. I think it's, of course, where someone's more vulnerable, it's inevitably going to attract. I get that, but it certainly shouldn't be racially based. And I think she has a point about that. If we're being honest, there probably is a media bias towards white women. Having said that, there's another side to that. You see, this is not a straightforward subject because when white people are victims of racial hate crimes, that doesn't get the same attention as when a black person is a victim of a racial hate crime. I mean, look at the Stephen Lawrence case, which was extensively covered. I can think of at least three young white men murdered for no other reason than being white, explicitly targeted for being white. The BBC, even BBC insiders, admitted that they were cautious about covering that as racist hate crimes, which is what they were. We have to have consistency. We have to have consistency. So if someone has been murdered because of the color of their skin, um, that should get coverage, in a consistent way. We also underplay the extent of police violence in the UK, in part because most officers do not carry guns. During a Black Lives Matter protest in London in 2017, following the death of Philando Castile in the US, I remember being pulled aside by an elderly person who insisted that this was not an issue in Britain. On the contrary, there have been killings in the UK too. There have been 1,833 deaths in or following police contact since 1990 in England and Wales, with Black, Asian, and minoritized ethnicities more likely to die disproportionately as a result of use of force or restraint by the police. We know of only two prosecutions for any of those deaths. Two out of 1,833. Now, I remember incidentally seeing a little sticker in Newcastle city centre about that. People might say, well, the reason there's only been two prosecutions is because they all were criminals and that's maybe they were resisting arrest or something. I personally think that's very alarming. I personally think there are serious, serious questions over that. two prosecutions out of 1,833 killings. Now, even if you allow that most of those were justified deaths, for example, the police were tackling an armed person, or someone was being violent and the police were protecting themselves, or they died from other causes, maybe could be anything. I find it very, very hard to believe that only two of those cases warranted a prosecution. Two. This suggests to me that the police do protect their own. So that statistic should be concerning to anybody who is reasonable. I mean, it is shocking. In recent days, I've been thinking about other black people killed by the police. Oladeji Omashore, Mark Duggan. Well, Mark Duggan, this is why you can't take every case as one and the same. Mark Duggan was a thug. I'm sorry, but he was. He had a long, violent criminal record. Lamont Roper, Mohammed Hassan, and Charles. They are people whose full existence will not ever be clear to us, but we may only have known them in death, which is being a bit disingenuous there by just presenting them as all one and the same. Mark Duggan, by the way, whose death sparked the Tottenham riots, which then led to the England riots, we do know that he was a violent career criminal. That's a matter of record. It may have been other things too, but that's the reality. They're not people whose full existence will not, headlines have slowly turned against them, reassuring us that we should not show them empathy, that we can be indifferent, that we can look away. We should mourn them because they were people, because they deserve to live, and because they have forever been deprived of the right to defend themselves. We must force ourselves to look at and name this injustice for what it is. On that point, yeah, absolutely. Wherever there is a death at police hands, it needs to be investigated independently. I believe that. Look at the death of John Charles de Menezes. We know that innocent people have died at police hands, but I think she's being a bit disingenuous by just reading them all off like it's one and the same. And ironically, she's actually stereotyping as well by presenting them all as innocent. My reverse question would be, well, what about the victims of Mark Duggan? This guy was a gang member. I mean, what about his innocent victims? It's the same with George Floyd. Floyd um, was involved in a burglary where a pregnant woman was in her house. Now, he may not have pulled the knife on her, but he was involved in that. So, this is one of the problems, as I see it, that black campaigners do. If there is institutional racism, they go to the other extreme of presenting every young black man who dies at police hands as completely innocent, as they've absolutely nothing going against them. There's absolutely no mitigating factors whatsoever. Now, by all accounts, Chris Kaba was unarmed. It's absolutely a serious incident, and his family deserves to know the truth. And if it transpires that he had absolutely, he wasn't resisting arrest, he wasn't armed, then the officer responsible should be charged with manslaughter and frankly serve time. Let me just say for the record, Chris Cabot's family deserve to know the truth and they deserve justice. Um, but what I would respectfully say about this op-ed is there's certainly some important points in it. For example, the statistic about number of prosecutions. I also think she's cherry picking and she is just treating all these cases as one and the same. They're not all one and the same. I would say, for example, the Chris Cabin case is very different from the Mark Duggan case. That's just as short sighted to say they're all the same. But as a general principle, I think to Mark Rowley, his priorities as Metropolitan Police Commissioner, absolutely number one is trying to get some semblance of confidence in the people of London. After all, that is the people they serve. And there's no bigger priority for the police than protecting the public. Now, they can't be everywhere at once, it's not always possible, but clearly that has to be the priority. I do think improving relations with the black community is very important. That's why they can't be seen to be protecting their own. There has to be full transparency. And if it's found that Chris Kaba was killed unlawfully, the officer or officers responsible have to face justice. Um, Even if he was in a stolen car, it doesn't mean he deserved to die. But frankly, black campaigners need to stop pretending that there isn't a problem in the black community with young men getting involved in crime. I think this failure to acknowledge that there is a problem and just dismissing everything as institutional racism, it doesn't really help solve some of the issues here or address some of the issues here. Why is it that young black men constantly have run into the police? Is it because all officers are just institutionally racist? I don't think so. Of course, you get white criminals as well, and there shouldn't be double standards in that regard. But like I say, some of this is 30 minutes. I'm going to wrap this up. Some of this is definitely cherry picking. Otherwise, she raises some valid points. I think she has a point about the white woman syndrome, and she certainly has a point about the disgraceful level of prosecutions among almost 2,000 deaths at police hands in 30 years. That's a very high figure. I mean, to put that in context, that's roughly the same number of people who were killed by the IRA, 40 years of the Trouble. So it's a lot of people. Um, and yeah, some of them, probably a lot of them, were in situations where the police were defending themselves or they were armed. But I think this is a very, very biased piece. You'll get bias on the other side. You'll have conservatives pretending that there are no problems whatsoever, and they're just as wrong. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. It's longer than I anticipate, but I think the issues are very important.